The thunder of hooves pounding across the hard, packed earth matched the rhythm of Zachary Stanton's heartbeat as he pushed his stallion to the limit, the wide Colorado sky stretching endlessly above him. The relentless pursuit of outlaws had been his sole purpose for 3 years, ever since the day he'd found his young wife Elizabeth and their infant son dead at the hands of the Blackwell gang. That day, something inside him had died to the part that knew how to feel anything but a cold, calculating desire for justice. It was 1878, and the West was still wild enough for a man to lose himself in the vastness of it all. Zachary had done just that, trading his soul for a deputy's badge in Montrose, Colorado, and a reputation as the most relentless lawman this side of the Rockies. His lean, weathered face rarely showed emotion, and folks had learned not to mention his past if they wanted to avoid the ice-cold stare of his steel-blue eyes. Sheriff Davis watched Zachary dismount outside the jailhouse, the dust of the trail still clinging to his duster. Any sign of them? "Track them to the ridge," Zachary replied, removing his hat to reveal dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. "Lost the trail when that storm hit. I'll head out again at first light." His voice was like gravel, worn down from disuse. "Zach," the sheriff said, his tone gentle but firm, "you've been riding for 3 days straight. Take a night to rest. Eat something that ain't jerky, maybe even remember what it's like to sleep in a real bed." Zachary merely nodded, knowing the older man was right. His body ached with fatigue, and even his horse needed rest. He led the animal to the livery stable, where he carefully removed the saddle and brushed down the stallion's sweaty coat. "You're a good boy, Thunder," he murmured, one of the few living creatures he still spoke to with any softness. The horse nudged his shoulder affectionately. The Golden Nugget Saloon was bustling when Zachary pushed through the swinging doors, but conversation momentarily faltered at his entrance. He cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with a grim set to his mouth and a Colt .45 strapped to his hip. People resumed their chatter, though more quietly, as he made his way to the bar. "Whiskey," he said to the barkeep, who nodded and poured without question. Zachary downed it in one swallow, feeling the familiar burn that did nothing to thaw the ice in his chest. Another. He was on his third when the piano music stopped abruptly, followed by a collective murmur rippling through the saloon. Zachary didn't turn, not particularly interested in whatever was causing the disturbance. "Excuse me," came a voice behind him, melodic and unfamiliar. "I heard the deputy might be here. I need to speak with him urgently." Zachary turned slowly, irritation flickering across his features until his eyes met hers. Standing before him was a woman unlike any he'd seen in Montrose. She wasn't dressed like a saloon girl or a farmer's wife, but in a simple, elegant traveling dress of deep blue that matched her eyes. Her chestnut hair was pinned up, though a few wayward curls had escaped to frame her face. But it was her expression that caught him off guard, a blend of determination and vulnerability that spoke of someone who had seen hardship but refused to be broken by it. "I'm Deputy Stanton," he said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. Relief washed over her face, and then unexpectedly she smiled. It was like watching the sun break through storm clouds, transforming her already beautiful face into something radiant. "Thank goodness," she said. "I'm Madeline Vale. I've come from Denver on the afternoon stage. I need your help, Deputy." Something shifted inside Zachary's chest, a rustling of feeling where there had been nothing but emptiness for so long. He blinked, unsettled by the sensation. "What kind of help, Miss Vale?" She glanced around the crowded saloon. "Could we speak somewhere more private? It's a matter of some delicacy." Zachary hesitated, then nodded, leaving a coin on the bar and leading her outside. The evening air had cooled considerably, and he noticed her slight shiver. "The sheriff's office is just down the street," he said, gesturing toward the jailhouse. They walked in silence, Zachary acutely aware of her presence beside him. Sheriff Davis looked up in surprise when they entered. "Evening, madam," he said, rising from his desk and removing his hat. "What brings you to our humble establishment?" "This is Miss Vale," Zachary said. "She has some business to discuss." Madeline stepped forward, composed but with an undercurrent of urgency. "I apologize for the intrusion, gentlemen. My father was Marcus Vale, a banker from Denver." "Was?" Sheriff Davis asked. "He died 3 weeks ago," she said, her voice steady despite the flash of grief in her eyes. "I believed it was due to his heart condition until I discovered certain documents in his study. My father had been investigating a series of fraudulent banking operations across Colorado. I believe he was murdered to prevent him from exposing the people responsible." Zachary's interest was piqued despite himself. "What makes you think that?" "This," she said, reaching into her reticule and withdrawing a folded paper. "A letter my father wrote the day before he died. He mentions a man named James Harker operating in Montrose." Zachary and the sheriff exchanged glances. "Harker arrived about 6 months ago," the sheriff said slowly. "Opened the Western Investment Company on Main Street. Been bringing in quite a bit of new money to town. According to my father's notes, he's been swindling investors across the territory," Madeline said. "And I believe he's connected to the men who killed my father." Zachary took the letter, scanning its contents. The handwriting grew increasingly erratic toward the end, as if written in haste or distress. The final lines chilled him. "If anything happens to me, the proof is in the ledger. Montrose is next. Trust no one. Why come to us?" Zachary asked, his suspicion natural after years of guarding against deception. "Denver has its own lawmen." Something flashed in Madeline's eyes, a spark of fire that suggested she wasn't as delicate as she first appeared. "I tried. 2 days after I spoke with them, my home was broken into and my father's study ransacked. Whoever did it was looking for that ledger." She lifted her chin. "I decided it wasn't safe to stay in Denver, and if Montrose is indeed next, as my father wrote, then I thought you should be warned." "Where is this ledger now?" the sheriff asked. "Hidden," she replied simply. "I won't reveal its location until I'm certain who can be trusted." Zachary studied her face, searching for signs of deception but finding none. Instead, he saw only determination, and a grief he recognized all too well, the kind that hardened into a quest for justice. "You'll need a safe place to stay," he said finally. "The Montrose Hotel isn't secure enough if these people followed you from Denver." "I've already checked in there," Madeline admitted, "under a different name, but still." Sheriff Davis stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "My sister runs a boarding house on the edge of town. Quiet, respectable place. I could arrange for you to stay there." "That would be most appreciated," she said, then turned to Zachary. "And what of my father's information? Will you look into it?" He met her gaze, feeling again that strange stirring within him. "I'll make inquiries about Harker, discreetly." "But Miss Vale, if what you're saying is true, these men are dangerous. You should consider returning to Denver once you've given us the ledger." She shook her head firmly. "My father died for this information. I won't simply hand it over and disappear. I intend to see justice done." The words echoed Zachary's own unspoken vow from 3 years ago, and for the first time, he felt a connection to another human being, a shared purpose that transcended mere duty. "Then we'd best get you settled at the boarding house," he said, reaching for his hat. "And tomorrow, we'll begin looking into Mr. Harker's business dealings." As they stepped back into the night, Madeline Vale smiled at him again, not the radiant smile from earlier, but something softer, grateful. "Thank you, Deputy Stanton." Zachary nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He couldn't explain why this woman's smile affected him so deeply, or why he suddenly felt protective of her beyond his official capacity. All he knew was that for the first time in 3 years, the frozen wasteland of his heart had begun to thaw ever so slightly, and the sensation was as terrifying as it was unexpected. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp autumn air that invigorated the senses. Zachary had spent a restless night, his dreams a confused tangle of past and present Elizabeth's face morphing into Madeline's, the sound of his infant son's laughter giving way to the echo of gunfire. He rose before sunrise, splashed cold water on his face, and stared at his reflection in the small mirror above his washstand. "Focus on the job," he muttered to himself. "Nothing else." He arrived at Mrs. Hollister's boarding house just as the sun crested the eastern mountains. The widow answered his knock, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. "Deputy Stanton," she said with a knowing smile. "Here to check on our new guest, I see. She's in the garden out back, already up with the birds, that one." Zachary found Madeline seated on a bench beneath an apple tree, a notebook open on her lap. She wore a simpler dress today, practical for the frontier town, though no less becoming on her slender frame. She looked up at his approach, and he was struck again by the clearness of her blue eyes. "Good morning, Deputy," she said, closing her notebook. "I hope I haven't kept you waiting." "Just arrived," he replied, removing his hat. "Did you sleep well?" "As well as can be expected," she admitted. "Mrs. Hollister has been very kind." An awkward silence fell between them, and Zachary cleared his throat. "I thought we might walk by the Western Investment Company this morning. Harker usually arrives around 9. We could observe the establishment, get a sense of his operation." Madeline rose, tucking her notebook into a small satchel. "That sounds sensible, though I should warn you if Harker is connected to my father's death he may recognize me." "We'll be careful," Zachary assured her. "Just a casual stroll down Main Street, nothing to attract attention." They walked side by side through the awakening town. Shopkeepers were unlocking their doors, and the smell of fresh bread wafted from the bakery. Zachary was acutely aware of Madeline beside him, of the curious glances from townspeople unaccustomed to seeing the somber deputy in female company. "Tell me about Montrose," Madeline said, breaking the silence. "How long have you been here?" 3 years, he replied. "It's a good town, honest folks for the most part." "And before that," Zachary's jaw tightened, "I was a rancher north of here." Something in his tone must have signaled that the subject was closed, for Madeline didn't press further. Instead, she asked, "What do you know of this James Harker?" "Not much," Zachary admitted. "Arrived in spring with plenty of cash and big ideas. Opened his investment company, began recruiting local businessmen to invest in various ventures, mining operations, railroad spurs, cattle concerns. Claims to have connections in Denver and St. Louis." "That matches my father's notes," Madeline said quietly. He suspected Harker of running what he called a circular investment scheme, using money from new investors to pay returns to earlier ones, all while skimming substantial amounts for himself. If that's true, it would collapse eventually. "Yes, but by then, he'd be gone with most of the money," Madeline explained. "According to my father, Harker operated under different names in 3 other towns before Denver, left a trail of financial ruin behind him." They reached Main Street and continued at a leisurely pace, pausing occasionally to look in shop windows as if they were merely taking a morning constitutional. The Western Investment Company occupied a handsome brick building midway down the block, its large front windows displaying a gilded sign promising secure investments for the modern West. "That's Harker now," Zachary murmured, nodding toward a well-dressed man approaching the building. James Harker cut an impressive figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with a neatly trimmed beard and expensive suit that set him apart from the typical Montrose resident. He moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to respect, nodding pleasantly to passers-by as he unlocked his office. "He doesn't look like a criminal," Madeline observed quietly. "The worst ones rarely do," Zachary replied, thinking of how ordinary the Blackwell gang had seemed before they'd revealed their true nature in blood and violence. As they watched, a young clerk arrived, followed shortly by two local businessmen whom Zachary recognized as the hotel owner and the proprietor of the town's largest mercantile. "He's certainly doing well for himself," Madeline said. "Those are influential men." "All with money to invest," Zachary noted grimly. "If Harker is what you say, he could devastate this town when he disappears." They continued walking, moving past the investment company without lingering suspiciously. Once they were safely out of earshot, Zachary guided Madeline toward the sheriff's office. "I need to see that ledger," he said. "If we're going to build a case against Harker, we need evidence." Madeline hesitated. "I need to trust you completely before I reveal its location." "You came to me for help," Zachary reminded her, an edge of frustration in his voice. "Yes, but—" She stopped suddenly, her face paling as she looked over Zachary's shoulder. "That man, crossing the street behind you, he was in Denver watching my house after the break-in." Zachary casually turned, as if surveying the street. A wiry man with a pockmarked face was indeed crossing toward them, his eyes fixed on Madeline with unmistakable recognition. "Keep walking," Zachary said softly, placing his hand on the small of her back to guide her forward. "Don't look at him again." They quickened their pace slightly, heading toward the sheriff's office. Zachary could feel the tension in Madeline's body beneath his hand. "He's following us," she whispered. "I know, just a few more yards." They had nearly reached the jailhouse when the man called out, "Miss Vale, what a surprise seeing you in Montrose." Madeline froze, and Zachary felt her tremble slightly beneath his touch. Then, with remarkable composure, she turned. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, sir," she said coolly. "My name is Mrs. Williams." The man smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Now, I'm sure that's not right. You're Marcus Vale's daughter from Denver. I was mighty sorry to hear about your father's passing." Zachary stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Madeline. "Is there something you need, mister?" The man's eyes flicked to Zachary's badge, and his smile faltered slightly. "Just greeting an acquaintance, deputy. No law against being friendly, is there?" "None at all," Zachary replied evenly. "But the lady says you're mistaken about her identity, so I suggest you move along." A tense moment passed before the man shrugged. "My mistake, then. Good day to you both." He tipped his hat and sauntered away, but Zachary noted how he glanced back over his shoulder as he turned the corner. "Inside," Zachary said quietly, opening the door to the sheriff's office. Madeline hurried through, her composure finally breaking once they were safely inside. "He was watching my house," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "After the break-in. I saw him from my window, just standing there for hours." Sheriff Davis, who had been reviewing wanted posters, rose from his desk with concern. "What's happened?" Zachary quickly explained the encounter while Madeline sank into a chair, her face pale but her eyes burning with determination. "This changes things," she said firmly. "I'll take you to the ledger now. It's not safe anymore." "Where is it?" Zachary asked. "I concealed it in my luggage, which I stored in the stage office's lockroom before checking into the hotel. I didn't want it in my room in case they searched there." Sheriff Davis nodded approvingly. Smart thinking, Miss Vale. I'd like Deputy Stanton to accompany me to retrieve it, she said, looking directly at Zachary with a trust that inexplicably warmed him. Of course, he replied. We should go now while your shadow is still reporting back to Harker. They left through the rear door of the sheriff's office, taking a circuitous route to the stage office. The clerk recognized Madeline from the previous day and readily retrieved her stored luggage, a modest leather trunk with brass fittings. I'd like to take this to the sheriff's office, if you don't mind helping, Deputy, she said for the benefit of the clerk. Zachary hefted the trunk, noting its substantial weight, and carried it back to the jailhouse. Once safely inside with the doors locked, Madeline knelt beside the trunk and opened it. She removed several layers of clothing before reaching for what appeared to be the trunk's false bottom. My father taught me to be prepared, she explained, sliding the panel aside to reveal a leather-bound ledger and a packet of letters tied with string. This contains all his evidence against Harker and his associates' bank transactions, dates, aliases, and the names of previous victims. Zachary took the ledger with a newfound respect for both Madeline and her late father. This must have taken months to compile. Almost a year, she confirmed. My father was meticulous. When he discovered discrepancies in accounts connected to Harker's business in Denver, he began tracing the man's history. What he found was a pattern of fraud stretching back 5 years across multiple territories. Sheriff Davis joined them at the desk as Zachary opened the ledger. The pages were filled with neat columns of figures, annotated with dates and locations. Certain entries were underlined in red ink, with notes in the margins connecting various transactions. This is damning evidence, the sheriff said, whistling softly. If authentic, it proves Harker's been running a massive swindle. It's authentic, Madeline insisted. My father risked his life gathering this information. He was going to take it to the territorial authorities the day after. Her voice caught, and she took a breath to steady herself. The day after he was killed. Zachary found himself wanting to comfort her but unsure how. It had been so long since he'd offered solace to another human being. Instead, he focused on the ledger, turning pages until he reached entries marked Montrose. Look here, he said. Harker's been setting up the same pattern here. Initial investments, false returns, recruitment of new investors. He traced a finger down the column of figures. According to this, he plans to clean out the accounts and disappear within the month. That would cripple half the businesses in town, the sheriff said grimly. We need to stop him before that happens. We need proof that the ledger is accurate, Zachary pointed out. And we need to connect Harker to Madeline's father's death if we're going to charge him with murder. Madeline leaned forward, her shoulder brushing against Zachary's as she pointed to a name in the margin. This man, Ellis Thornton, was Harker's partner in Denver. My father's notes suggest he handles the messier aspects of their business. The man who recognized you on the street, Zachary said thoughtfully. Could that have been Thornton? Madeline shook her head. No, I've seen Thornton at social events in Denver. He's older, distinguished looking. The man today was likely one of their hired men. Sheriff Davis stroked his mustache thoughtfully. We need to verify these banking records. That would be enough to arrest Harker for fraud, at least. I could telegraph the banks mentioned here, Zachary suggested. Request confirmation of these transactions. That would take days, Madeline objected. And alert Harker that we're investigating him. If he suspects, he'll flee with whatever money he's already collected. She's right, the sheriff admitted. We need to move carefully. A plan began forming in Zachary's mind, risky but potentially effective. What if we had someone approach Harker as a potential investor? Someone who could get close enough to verify the operation from the inside. Who did you have in mind? The sheriff asked. Me, Zachary said simply. Both Madeline and the sheriff looked at him in surprise. "You're the deputy," Madeline pointed out. "Surely Harker knows that." "I also own a small ranch outside of town," Zachary replied. It was meant to be. He swallowed hard, pushing away memories of the home he'd planned to build for Elizabeth and their son. "It's been sitting mostly unused these past years. I could approach Harker claiming I've decided to sell it and I'm looking for investment opportunities for the proceeds." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Might work, though it would be more convincing if you weren't wearing that badge when you did it." "I'll leave it here," Zachary agreed. "It's dangerous," Madeline said, concern evident in her voice. "If Harker suspects you're investigating him, I can handle myself," Zachary assured her, unexpectedly touched by her worry. "And we don't have many other options if we want to stop him before he ruins the town." After further discussion, they agreed on the plan. Zachary would approach Harker the next morning as a potential investor, while the sheriff would telegraph neighboring towns where Harker had previously operated, seeking additional evidence. Madeline would remain at Mrs. Hollister's boarding house under the sheriff's sister's watchful eye. "I don't like being sidelined," Madeline admitted as Zachary walked her back to the boarding house that afternoon. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the dusty street. "You're not sidelined," Zachary told her. "You're protected. There's a difference." "I've been taking care of myself since my mother died when I was 16, she replied with a hint of defensiveness. "I'm not some delicate flower needing shelter from the wind." "I never thought you were," Zachary said, and meant it. For all her refined appearance, Madeline Vale had shown more courage and determination than many men he'd known. "But these are dangerous men, and they already know you're in Montrose." They walked in silence for a moment before Madeline spoke again, her voice softer. "Why did you become a lawman, Mr. Stanton? Something tells me you weren't born to it." The question caught him off guard. No one in Montrose had asked him that directly in years. They either knew the story or sensed it was better left unasked. "I wasn't," he admitted, the words feeling rusty in his mouth. "I had a ranch. A small one but good land with a creek running through it. I was building it up, planning for the future." "What changed?" Zachary looked straight ahead, his jaw tight. 3 years ago, a gang of outlaws came through these parts. The Blackwell Gang. They hit isolated homesteads, taking what they wanted and... He couldn't continue for a moment, the memories suddenly as fresh as yesterday. "My wife and son were home alone when they came. I was in town getting supplies." "Oh, Zachary," Madeline whispered, and the sound of his given name on her lips nearly broke him. "I'm so sorry. Sheriff Davis gave me the badge after I tracked down 2 of the gang members," he continued, his voice hollow. "Seemed like a purpose when I had none left." Impulsively, Madeline placed her hand on his arm, the gentle pressure somehow anchoring him to the present. "I understand loss," she said quietly. "Not the same as yours, but I know how it can hollow you out, leave you feeling like a stranger in your own life." Their eyes met, and Zachary felt a jolt of recognition, not of physical features, but of the soul-deep understanding that can only exist between people who have walked through fire and emerged forever changed. The moment was broken by the sound of approaching footsteps. They both turned to see Mrs. Hollister on her porch, waving to them. "Supper's nearly ready, Miss Vale," the older woman called. "Deputy, you're welcome to join us if you've a mind to." Before Zachary could decline, Madeline spoke. "Please do, Deputy. We have more to discuss about tomorrow." He found himself nodding, unable to refuse her direct gaze. As they continued toward the boarding house, Madeline's hand slipped from his arm, but the warmth of her touch lingered like a promise, or perhaps a warning of how easily she could breach the walls he'd built around his heart. Supper at Mrs. Hollister's proved to be a livelier affair than Zachary had anticipated. In addition to Madeline, there were two other boarders, a young school teacher named Miss Peterson and an elderly gentleman, Mr. Calloway, who had once prospected for gold and now entertained anyone who would listen with tales of his adventures. Mrs. Hollister served a hearty meal of beef stew, corn bread, and apple pie, all while keeping the conversation flowing with gentle prompting. Zachary found himself speaking more than he had in months, drawn out by the comfortable atmosphere, and, he had to admit, by Madeline's attentive presence across the table. "Deputy Stanton, is it true you tracked the Wallace brothers for 5 days through the mountains?" Mr. Calloway asked, eyes bright with curiosity. 7 days, Zachary corrected, uncomfortable with being the center of attention. They weren't hard to track, left a trail a blind man could follow. But catching them now that took courage, Mrs. Hollister said admiringly. Those two were responsible for the stage robbery that killed poor Mr. Jenkins. Zachary merely nodded, not wanting to elaborate on the violent confrontation that had ended with both Wallace brothers in pine boxes. "I think it takes a special kind of person to pursue justice so diligently," Madeline said quietly, her eyes meeting his across the table. "Someone with principle and determination." "Or stubbornness," Zachary replied with the ghost of a smile. "Perhaps a bit of both," she acknowledged, returning his smile with a warmth that seemed to reach across the table and touch him physically. After supper, Mrs. Hollister shooed everyone onto the porch to enjoy the pleasant evening air while she cleared away the dishes, refusing all offers of help. The school teacher excused herself to prepare lessons, and Mr. Calloway nodded off in his rocking chair, leaving Zachary and Madeline with a measure of privacy at the far end of the porch. "I should go," Zachary said, rising from his chair. "I need to prepare for tomorrow's meeting with Harker." Madeline stood as well. "I'll walk you to the gate." They moved down the porch steps and along the short garden path in companionable silence. The evening air was cool but not cold, fragrant with the scent of late blooming flowers and the approaching autumn. At the gate, Zachary turned to her. "Stay close to the house tomorrow. Don't go anywhere alone." "I'll be careful," she promised. Then, with a hint of mischief in her eyes, she added, "Though I'm tempted to follow you to Harker's office, just to see how you fare as an investor rather than a lawman." "That would be a poor idea," he said firmly, though he found himself fighting a smile at her spirited suggestion. "Harker's already suspicious, if he saw you." "I know," she sighed. "I just feel useless staying here while you take all the risks." "You've already taken enormous risks bringing your father's evidence here," Zachary pointed out. "Without your courage, we wouldn't even know about Harker's scheme until it was too late." She looked up at him, her expression softening. "Thank you for saying that. And for believing me when others might not have. I'm a fair judge of character," he said simply. "You're not someone who would invent such a story." Madeline hesitated, then reached out to touch his arm again, her fingers light against the rough fabric of his coat. "Be careful tomorrow, Zachary. These men have already killed once. I couldn't bear it if—" She stopped herself, seeming embarrassed by her own vehemence. Something stirred in Zachary's chest, a feeling so long dormant he barely recognized it. The impulse to reassure her, to protect her, went beyond his duty as a lawman. It was personal in a way nothing had been for 3 long years. "I'll be careful," he promised, his voice rougher than he intended. Their eyes held for a long moment before Zachary reluctantly pulled away. "Good night, Miss Vale." "Madeline," she corrected softly. "After everything we've shared, I think you might call me Madeline." He nodded, unable to form words around the sudden tightness in his throat. With a final look at her standing in the lamplight, her face soft with concern, He turned and walked into the gathering darkness, his thoughts more tumultuous than they had been in years. Dawn found Zachary at his small cabin on the outskirts of town, preparing for his meeting with Harker. He changed into his best shirt, and the suit he hadn't worn since Elizabeth's funeral, carefully stowing his deputy's badge in a drawer. The man in the mirror looked like a stranger clean-shaven, hair neatly combed, dressed like a prosperous rancher rather than a hard-bitten lawman. He arrived at the Western Investment Company just as Harker was unlocking the door. The businessman looked surprised, then pleased to see him. "Deputy Stanton, isn't it?" Harker said, extending his hand. "What brings you to my establishment so early in the day?" "Not deputy today," Zachary replied, accepting the handshake. "Just a man with some business to discuss if you have the time." Interest flickered in Harker's eyes. "Always have time for business. Please come in." The office was opulently furnished compared to most Montrose establishments, with leather chairs, a polished oak desk, and framed certificates adorning the walls. Harker gestured for Zachary to take a seat while he unlocked a cabinet and withdrew a decanter. "Brandy." "I know it's early, but I find it helps lubricate business discussions." "No, thank you," Zachary declined. "I prefer to keep a clear head for financial matters." Harker smiled approvingly. "A wise policy. Now, what kind of business brings Montrose's stalwart lawman to my door?" Zachary leaned forward slightly, adopting the air of a man about to share a confidence. "I'm selling my ranch. It's been sitting mostly idle these past years while I've worn the badge, and I've finally decided it's time to let it go." "I see," Harker said, his interest visibly increasing. "And you're looking for investment opportunities for the proceeds, I take it?" "Exactly," Zachary confirmed. "I've heard good things about your company from several businessmen in town. They seem quite pleased with the returns they've received." Harker smiled broadly. "I pride myself on delivering for my investors. The West is growing, Mr. Stanton, and there's money to be made for those wise enough to position themselves properly." He reached for a leather portfolio on his desk. "I have several opportunities that might interest you." "May I ask the approximate value of your property?" "The land alone is worth $5,000, Zachary said, quoting a figure substantial enough to capture Harker's full attention. "With the improvements and water rights, closer to $8,000. He watched Harker's expression carefully, noting the gleam of avarice that the man quickly masked with professional interest. "An impressive sum," Harker said smoothly. "With that kind of capital, you could participate in our premium investment program." He withdrew several documents from the portfolio. "I'm currently organizing a consortium to purchase mining claims in the San Juan Mountains. Initial investors are projected to receive returns of 20% within the first 6 months. 20%. Zachary raised his eyebrows in feigned impressed disbelief. "That's considerably better than the bank's 3%. "Banks," Harker said dismissively, "are for those without vision or courage, Mr. Stanton. Men like you and I understand that fortune favors the bold." For the next half hour, Harker outlined various investment opportunities, each promising extraordinary returns. Zachary listened attentively, asking questions that suggested both interest and financial acumen. He noted how Harker avoided specifics about the actual operations being funded, focusing instead on projected profits and the prestigious names of other investors. "I'm intrigued," Zachary said finally, "particularly by the mining venture. I'd like to review these prospectuses in detail before making a decision." "Of course," Harker agreed, gathering the documents into a folder which he handed to Zachary. "Take your time, though I should mention that the mining consortium will close to new investors by the end of next week. We've nearly reached our capitalization goal." creating a sense of urgency to pressure me into investing quickly, Zachary thought. Aloud, he said, I appreciate the opportunity. I should have an answer for you within a few days. Excellent. Harker rose, extending his hand again. I look forward to welcoming you to our family of investors, Mr. Stanton. As they shook hands, the office door opened, and a man entered, the same pockmarked individual who had confronted Madeline the previous day. He stopped short at the sight of Zachary, his hand instinctively moving toward the gun at his hip. Ah, Raid, Harker said smoothly. This is Mr. Stanton, a potential investor. Mr. Stanton, my associate, Mr. Reed. Zachary nodded curtly, maintaining his composure despite the tension crackling in the air. Mr. Raid. The man's eyes narrowed suspiciously. You're the deputy. When I'm wearing the badge, Zachary replied evenly. Today I'm here on personal business. Harker's expression changed subtly, a flicker of wariness replacing his earlier geniality. Is that so? I wasn't aware our local lawmen had such entrepreneurial interests. A man can't live on a deputy's salary forever, Zachary said with a shrug. I'm looking toward my future. Indeed, Harker murmured, studying Zachary with new intensity. Well, as I said, review those materials and let me know your decision. Zachary left the investment office with the distinct feeling of eyes boring into his back. He resisted the urge to look over his shoulder, instead maintaining a casual pace as he headed toward the sheriff's office. Once inside, he found Sheriff Davis waiting expectantly. Well, the older man asked. Harker's running exactly the scheme Madeline's father documented, Zachary confirmed, placing the investment prospectuses on the desk. Vague descriptions, promised returns far beyond what's reasonable, and pressure to invest quickly before the opportunity disappears. The sheriff examined the documents, shaking his head in disgust. Slick work. No wonder he's been successful. Did you get a sense of his timeline? He mentioned the mining consortium closing to investors next week. According to the ledger, that would be when he starts converting assets to cash before disappearing. We don't have much time then, the sheriff said grimly. Any sign he suspected your true purpose? Not until his man Reed arrived, the same one who recognized Madeline yesterday. He identified me as a deputy, which made Harker suspicious. Zachary frowned. They'll be watching me now. And likely watching Miss Vale even more closely, the sheriff added. I'd better check on her. I'll go, Zachary said quickly, then felt heat rise in his face at the knowing look the sheriff gave him. She's my responsibility, he added more gruffly. Of course she is, Sheriff Davis replied with the ghost of a smile. While you do that, I'll send those telegrams to the other towns where Harker operated. With any luck, we'll have responses by tomorrow. Zachary strode purposefully toward Mrs. Hollister's boarding house, his mind racing with possibilities. Harker was clearly running a sophisticated swindle, but proving it legally before he absconded with the town's money would be challenging. And if they could connect him to Marcus Vale's murder, even better, but that evidence might be harder to obtain. His thoughts shifted to Madeline, to the courage she'd shown in coming to Montrose alone to seek justice for her father. She'd risked everything, and now she was in danger because of it. The need to protect her surged through him with surprising force. Mrs. Hollister met him at the door with a worried expression. Deputy, I was about to send for you. Miss Vale is gone. Alarm shot through him. Gone? What do you mean? She received a note about an hour ago, Mrs. Hollister explained. Said it was from you, asking her to meet you at the sheriff's office. I thought it strange you didn't come yourself, but she seemed certain it was genuine. Zachary's blood ran cold. I sent no note. Oh dear Lord, Mrs. Hollister whispered, her hand flying to her throat. That poor girl. I should have insisted on accompanying her. It's not your fault, Zachary assured her, though his heart was pounding with fear and anger. When exactly did she leave? Not more than 20 minutes ago. She walked toward town. If anything's happened to her. Zachary couldn't complete the thought. I need to find her. Now. He rushed back toward town, his mind racing. If Harker's men had lured Madeline away with a false note, they could have taken her anywhere. The sheriff's office was the obvious first place to check, but he doubted she'd made it that far. As he rounded the corner onto Main Street, a flicker of movement in the alley beside the Western Investment Company caught his eye. A man, Reed, was escorting a woman through the rear door of the building. Even from a distance, Zachary recognized Madeline's blue dress and chestnut hair. His first instinct was to charge in immediately, but he forced himself to think strategically. Reed was armed, and there might be others inside. Going in without a plan could get Madeline killed. He hurried to the sheriff's office, bursting through the door. "They've got her," he said without preamble. Harker's men took Madeline into their office through the back door. Sheriff Davis rose immediately, reaching for his gun belt. "How many men inside?" Harker, Reed for certain, possibly others. "We need to move carefully," the sheriff cautioned. "If they've taken her, they must be desperate. Desperate men do foolish things." Zachary strapped on his gun belt, checking his Colt revolver before securing it in the holster. "I'm going in through the back. You take the front. We need to surprise them before they can use Madeline as leverage." The sheriff nodded grimly. "Give me 5 minutes to get into position." Zachary counted every second of those 5 minutes as he circled behind the row of buildings to reach the rear of the Western Investment Company. The back door was locked, but a window nearby stood slightly ajar. He listened carefully, hearing muffled voices from inside. "Won't ask again, Miss Vale," came Harker's voice, tense with anger. "Where is the ledger?" "I've told you it's somewhere safe," Madeline replied, her voice steady despite the obvious danger she was in. "Somewhere you'll never find it." The sound of a sharp slap made Zachary's blood boil. Moving silently, he eased the window open wider and slipped inside, finding himself in a small storeroom adjacent to the main office. Through the partially open door, he could see Madeline seated in a chair, her hands bound behind her. Harker stood over her, his face flushed with anger. Reed leaned against the wall, a revolver held casually in his hand. "Your father should have minded his own business," Harker snarled. "Just like you should have. You think we won't kill you too?" "If you kill me, the ledger goes straight to the territorial authorities," Madeline said defiantly, despite the red mark blooming on her cheek. "I've arranged for that." "She's bluffing," Reed drawled. "Let me persuade her to be more cooperative, boss." Zachary had heard enough. Drawing his revolver, he kicked the storeroom door fully open. "Drop your weapon, Reed." Both men whirled in surprise. Reed raised his gun, but Zachary was faster, firing a shot that caught the man in the shoulder. Reed howled in pain, his revolver clattering to the floor as he clutched his wounded arm. Harker lunged for a desk drawer, but froze as the front door burst open and Sheriff Davis entered, shotgun leveled at the businessman's chest. "Don't move, Harker," the sheriff ordered. "Hands where I can see them." For a tense moment, it seemed Harker might still reach for whatever weapon lay in the drawer, but finally he raised his hands in surrender, his face contorted with rage and defeat. Zachary rushed to Madeline, holstering his weapon to untie her bonds. "Are you hurt?" "Only my pride," she said, rubbing her wrists as the ropes fell away. Despite her brave words, he could see she was shaken, her eyes bright with unshed tears of relief. Without thinking, Zachary pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as if to reassure himself she was truly safe. She clung to him, her body trembling slightly against his. "I knew you'd come," she whispered against his chest. The sheriff secured both Harker and the wounded Reed, then began searching the office. "Well, well," he said, pulling papers from the desk drawer Harker had been reaching for. "Looks like train tickets to San Francisco, departing tomorrow, and quite a substantial bank draft. Planning your departure a bit ahead of schedule, weren't you, Harker?" Zachary said coldly, still keeping one arm protectively around Madeline's shoulders. "You've got nothing on me," Harker spat. "A few investment papers prove nothing illegal." "The ledger proves otherwise," Madeline said, straightening her spine as she faced her father's killer. "As does your attempt to kidnap me, and I suspect those telegrams the sheriff sent to other towns will bring additional evidence of your crimes." Harker's face paled slightly at the mention of other towns. "You're bluffing." "No," Sheriff Davis said, producing one of the telegrams that had arrived earlier. "Already got a response from Silver Creek. Seems you left quite an impression there 2 years ago under the name James Harrison. They're still trying to recover from the financial damage you caused." The fight seemed to drain out of Harker as he realized the extent of the evidence mounting against him. "I want a lawyer," he muttered. "You'll get one at your trial," the sheriff assured him. "Along with a nice long stay in the territorial prison, if I have anything to say about it." With the prisoners secured in jail cells, Zachary escorted Madeline back to Mrs. Hollister's boarding house. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as they walked, neither speaking much, both processing the events of the day. "I should have known the note wasn't from you," Madeline said finally, breaking the silence. "It didn't sound like you." "It's not your fault," Zachary assured her. "Harker's been running these scams for years. He's convincing. Still, I put myself in danger and I put you at risk coming after me." She looked up at him, her blue eyes troubled. "I'm sorry for that." "Don't be," he said firmly. "You came to Montrose seeking justice for your father, knowing the risks. That takes courage most men don't possess." They had reached the boarding house gate, but neither made a move to open it. Instead, they stood facing each other in the golden light of late afternoon, something unspoken hanging in the air between them. "What will you do now?" Zachary asked, realizing with a pang that, with Harker captured, Madeline had no reason to remain in Montrose. "I need to stay for the trial," she said, "to testify about my father's evidence. After that." She hesitated, her eyes searching his. "I'm not sure. Denver holds sad memories now, and there's nothing really keeping me there." Hope flickered in Zachary's chest, a sensation so foreign he almost didn't recognize it. "Montrose is a growing town," he heard himself say. "Might be opportunities here for someone with your intelligence and courage." A slow smile spread across Madeline's face, that same radiant smile that had first pierced the armor around his heart. "Are you suggesting I might have a reason to stay, Deputy Stanton?" "I'm suggesting you might consider it," he replied carefully, not quite ready to name the feelings stirring within him. "At least until you're certain what you want." Madeline's expression softened, understanding in her eyes. "Some decisions shouldn't be rushed," she agreed. "Especially important ones." As they stood there, the distance between them seemed both vast and infinitesimal, a chasm of grief and loss, yet bridged by the tentative connection they'd formed in just a few short days. "Tomorrow," Zachary said, "would you ride with me out to my ranch? There's something I'd like to show you." "I'd like that very much," Madeline replied, her voice warm with promise. As Zachary walked back to town, he felt lighter somehow, as if the weight he'd carried for 3 years had begun to ease just slightly. He couldn't say yet whether the feelings growing within him would blossom into something lasting, or whether Madeline would choose to remain in Montrose when her business was concluded. But for the first time since that terrible day 3 years ago, He found himself looking forward to tomorrow with something more than grim determination, with hope, fragile but real. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of pristine blue sky that seemed unique to Colorado autumn. Zachary arrived at Mrs. Hollister's boarding house just after breakfast, leading 2 horses, his own stallion, Thunder, and a gentle mare he'd borrowed from the livery stable. Madeline was waiting on the porch, dressed in a practical riding skirt and jacket that highlighted the slender curves of her figure. Her hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and her cheeks were flushed with anticipation. "Good morning," she greeted him, descending the steps with a grace that belied her frontier attire. "I hope I'm dressed appropriately for our ride." "You look perfect," Zachary said, then felt heat rise in his face at his own forthrightness. "For riding, I mean." A small smile played at the corners of her mouth as she approached the mare. "She's lovely. What's her name?" "Buttercup," Zachary replied, helping Madeline into the saddle. "Not very original, but she answers to it." The casual touch of his hands at her waist sent a jolt through him, a reminder of how long it had been since he'd allowed himself to be this close to another person. If Madeline felt a similar reaction, she concealed it well, settling into the saddle with the confidence of someone who had ridden since childhood. They rode at a leisurely pace out of town, following a well-worn trail that wound through rolling grasslands toward the foothills. The morning air was invigorating, scented with sage and pine, and Zachary found himself pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the area, things he hadn't thought about in years. "It's beautiful country," Madeline observed, her eyes taking in the vast landscape. "I can see why you chose to make your home here." "It wasn't a difficult choice," Zachary admitted. "First time I rode through this valley, I knew this was where I wanted to put down roots." "And your ranch, is it far from town?" "About 5 miles," he replied. "Far enough for privacy, close enough for convenience." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the rhythm of the horses' hooves a soothing counterpoint to Zachary's thoughts. He was leading Madeline to a place he hadn't visited in nearly 3 years, the home he'd built for a future that had been violently stolen from him. He wasn't entirely sure why he felt compelled to share it with her now, only that it seemed important somehow. As they crested a gentle rise, the ranch came into view in the valley below, a modest 2-story house, weathered but still solid, with a barn and corral nearby. A creek meandered through the property, lined with cottonwood trees just beginning to turn golden with autumn. Madeline drew her horse to a halt beside his, gazing down at the picturesque scene. "It's lovely, Zachary, but it looks uninhabited." "It is," he said simply. "I haven't lived here since Elizabeth and James died." Understanding filled her eyes. "This was your home with them." He nodded, unable to speak for a moment as memories washed over him. Elizabeth hanging curtains in the front windows, baby James taking his first tottering steps across the porch, the 3 of them sitting by the fireplace on winter evenings. "Why did you bring me here?" Madeline asked gently. Zachary took a deep breath. "Because yesterday, when I told Harker I was selling this place, I realized it was actually true. I've been holding on to it like a shrine, but never living in it, never moving forward." He met her gaze directly. "And then I thought about how you faced your father's death by seeking justice, not by hiding from your grief." "Oh, Zachary," she said softly, "grief isn't something you can measure or compare. We each find our way through it differently." "Maybe," he conceded. "But I've been standing still for 3 years, letting my life pass by while I focused only on hunting outlaws and bringing in wanted men. That's not living, it's just existing." They guided their horses down the slope toward the ranch house, neither speaking until they reached the front yard. Zachary dismounted and helped Madeline down, acutely aware of the slender strength of her waist beneath his hands. "Would you like to see inside?" he asked, nodding toward the house. "If you're comfortable showing me," she replied, her eyes searching his. He led her up the porch steps, pausing briefly before unlocking the door. The interior was clean but sparse, most of the furniture covered with sheets to protect it from dust. Zachary moved through the rooms with Madeline beside him, occasionally lifting a cloth to reveal a table or chair. "I kept meaning to come back," he said as they entered what had once been the parlor, "to pack things away properly or decide what to do with it all, but I could never bring myself to do it." Madeline touched his arm gently. "It's hard to let go of the tangible reminders of those we've lost. My father's study in Denver, I couldn't bear to change anything in it, even when practical considerations said I should." Her understanding, free of judgment, loosened something in Zachary's chest. "When Elizabeth and I built this house, we had such plans." Children running through the rooms, holiday gatherings, growing old together on that porch. His voice roughened with emotion. "For a long time, I couldn't imagine any other future, couldn't imagine wanting one." Madeline's hand slipped into his, her fingers warm and reassuring. "And now?" Zachary looked down at their joined hands, then back to her face, her blue eyes filled with compassion and something more, something that made his heart beat faster. "Now I think maybe there can be different futures than the ones we plan," he said quietly. "Not better or worse, just different." They moved through the remainder of the house, Zachary sharing memories more freely than he had in years. In the kitchen, he told her about Elizabeth's attempts to master the temperamental wood stove. In the small study, he showed her the bookshelf he'd built by hand. Upstairs, he hesitated outside the nursery door, then passed by without opening it. Some steps couldn't be taken all at once. Back outside, they sat on the porch steps, looking out over the land that was still beautiful despite its neglect. "What will you do with it?" Madeline asked. "Were you serious about selling?" "I think so," Zachary replied thoughtfully. "Not because I need the money, but because it deserves to be a home again, not a memorial." He glanced at her. "What about you? Will you return to Denver after the trial?" Madeline gazed out at the sweeping landscape, considering. "I'm not sure there's anything for me there anymore. The house is too big for just me, filled with memories of my parents." She turned to him with a small smile. "I've been thinking I might like a fresh start somewhere. Somewhere like Montrose, perhaps." Hope bloomed in Zachary's chest, unfamiliar but welcome. "Montrose could use someone with your intelligence and spirit. The town's growing might be opportunities for a woman of your capabilities." "And would you?" she began, then hesitated. "Would you be pleased if I stayed?" The question hung between them, simple yet profound in its implications. Zachary found himself at a crossroads: continue on the solitary path he'd walked for 3 years, or take a chance on the feelings growing between them. "Yes," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "I would be very pleased, Madeline." The smile that illuminated her face was worth every moment of vulnerability the admission had cost him. On impulse, Zachary reached out to touch her cheek, his calloused fingers gentle against her soft skin. "I never expected to feel this way again," he confessed quietly. "Didn't think I wanted to." "Nor did I," Madeline replied, leaning slightly into his touch. "After my father died, I was so consumed with finding justice that I didn't allow myself to think about what would come after. And now I find myself thinking about possibilities I hadn't considered before." They were close enough that Zachary could feel the warmth of her breath, could see the flecks of darker blue in her eyes. The moment stretched between them, taut with possibility, until finally he gathered his courage and leaned forward to press his lips gently against hers. The kiss was tentative at first, a question rather than a demand. But when Madeline's hand came up to rest against his chest, when she responded with a softness that matched his own. Something broke free within Zachary, a flood of emotion he'd kept dammed up for too long. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Zachary rested his forehead against hers. "I don't want to rush this," he said quietly. "You deserve better than a man still wrestling with his ghosts." "We all have ghosts, Zachary," she replied with quiet wisdom. "What matters is whether we let them determine our future." They remained on the porch a while longer, talking of simpler things, childhood memories, favorite books, hopes for the town's future. When the midday sun was high overhead, they reluctantly mounted their horses for the ride back to Montrose. As they crested the rise that would take the ranch out of sight, Zachary paused for one last look. The house stood as it had for 3 years, but somehow it seemed different now, not a shrine to what he had lost, but a reminder that life continued, that new beginnings were possible. Beside him, Madeline waited patiently, her presence a promise of possibilities he was just beginning to allow himself to imagine. With a nod of quiet resolution, he turned his horse toward Montrose, toward whatever future might await them there. The weeks that followed were filled with a careful dance of growing closeness balanced against the practical matters that demanded attention. Harker and Reed were transported to Denver for trial, accompanied by Sheriff Davis and the evidence from Marcus Vale's ledger. Madeline followed to testify, but not before extracting a promise from Zachary that he would write to her regularly during her absence. Those letters became a lifeline for both of them, a way to nurture their budding feelings while separated by distance. Zachary, who had barely written more than official reports for years, found himself pouring out thoughts and memories he'd never shared with anyone. In turn, Madeline's letters revealed her hopes, her dry wit, and her growing attachment to him, expressed with a candor that both thrilled and humbled him. When she returned to Montrose after 2 weeks, the whole town turned out to greet her with the news. Harker and his accomplices had been convicted not only of fraud but of first-degree murder in the death of Marcus Vale. Justice had been served. The reunion at the stage station was a public affair, with townsfolk crowding around to congratulate Madeline, but the look that passed between her and Zachary spoke of a more private reunion to come. That evening, they walked along the creek that wound through town, finally free to speak of personal matters without the shadow of Harker's crimes hanging over them. "I've been thinking about your ranch," Madeline said as they paused on a small footbridge, watching the water ripple beneath them. "About what you said regarding it deserving to be a home again." Zachary looked at her questioningly. "What about it? What if?" She hesitated, then continued with characteristic directness. "What if it became a home again, but with new memories layered over the old ones? Not erasing the past, but building on it." His heart quickened at her implication. "Are you suggesting what I think you are?" Madeline turned to face him fully, her expression open and vulnerable. "I'm saying that I've fallen in love with you, Zachary Stanton. That I believe we could build a good life together, if you wanted that too." The words he'd never expected to hear again from anyone struck him with physical force. For a moment, he couldn't respond, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was offering. "Madeline," he finally managed, taking her hands in his. "I want that more than I can say, but I need to be sure you understand what you'd be taking on. I'm not the same man I was before I lost Elizabeth and James. There are parts of me that may always be scarred by what happened." "I'm not asking you to be who you were before," she said softly. "I'm saying I love who you are now, a man of integrity and courage, who's faced the worst life can offer and still found the strength to open his heart again." She squeezed his hands. "I don't want to replace what you lost, Zachary. I want to walk beside you into whatever future we might create together." In that moment, the last of his resistance crumbled. Pulling her gently into his arms, Zachary kissed her with all the emotion he'd held in check for so long, the grief and loneliness giving way to hope and possibility. "I love you," he whispered against her lips when they finally parted. "I didn't think I'd ever say those words again, but I love you, Madeline Vale." Her smile, radiant in the gathering twilight, was all the answer he needed. The news of their engagement spread through Montrose with the speed only a small town can generate. Most people responded with genuine delight. The grim deputy and the courageous banker's daughter had captured the community's imagination during the Harker affair, and their romance seemed a fitting conclusion to the drama. Mrs. Hollister insisted on hosting a small celebration at her boarding house, while Sheriff Davis clapped Zachary on the back with almost fatherly approval. "About time you rejoined the land of the living," the older man said gruffly. "She's a fine woman, Zach." "Better than I deserve," Zachary agreed, watching as Madeline chatted animatedly with the schoolteacher across the room. "Nonsense," the sheriff retorted. "You've carried your burden long enough. Elizabeth would want you to be happy, you know that." And strangely, Zachary did know it. The guilt he'd expected to feel at opening his heart to someone new had not materialized. Instead, there was a sense of rightness, as if this new chapter was not a betrayal of the past, but its natural evolution. They were married on a crisp October day, with the aspen trees glowing gold against the mountainsides. The ceremony was held in the small church in town, with most of Montrose in attendance. Madeline wore a gown of ivory silk that had belonged to her mother, and carried wildflowers gathered from the meadows around the ranch. Zachary, standing at the altar in a new suit, felt a momentary panic when the church doors opened, not from doubt about his decision, but from the sheer wonder of it. As Madeline walked toward him, her face glowing with happiness, he was struck by the unexpected journey that had brought them to this moment. 3 years ago, he had believed his capacity for love had died with Elizabeth. Now, watching his bride approach, he marveled at the heart's ability to heal, to expand, to embrace new joy without diminishing old memories. The celebration afterwards spilled out into the town square, with music and dancing continuing well into the evening. As dusk fell, Zachary and Madeline slipped away from the festivities, boarding a wagon he had prepared for the journey to the ranch, their home now, reclaimed from the shadows of the past. They arrived as the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Zachary lifted Madeline down from the wagon, then surprised her by sweeping her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. Inside, the house had been transformed. During the weeks of their engagement, they had worked together to remove the dust covers, rearrange furniture, and add touches that made the space truly theirs. Madeline's books on the shelves beside his, her mother's china in the kitchen cupboards, fresh curtains at the windows. "Welcome home, Mrs. Stanton," Zachary said softly, setting her down in the parlor where a fire was already laid in the fireplace, courtesy of Sheriff Davis, who had ridden ahead to prepare for their arrival. "It's perfect," Madeline replied, her eyes shining as she turned in a slow circle to take in the room. "I can feel it already. This is where we belong." Later, in the quiet intimacy of their bedroom, Zachary confessed his final fear. "I worried that being here with you would feel like a betrayal," he admitted, stroking her hair as she lay nestled against him. "That Elizabeth's ghost would somehow stand between us." Madeline propped herself up on one elbow to look at him, her expression tender in the soft glow of the bedside lamp. "She'll always be part of your past, Zachary, part of what made you the man I fell in love with. That's not something to fear or avoid, it's something to honor." He kissed her then, overwhelmed by her wisdom and generosity of spirit. "How did I get so fortunate?" he wondered aloud. To find not one but two extraordinary women to share my life. Perhaps the universe decided you deserved a second chance at happiness, she suggested, settling back against him. Just as I did. In the months that followed, they built a life together that honored the past while embracing their future. The ranch came alive again with activity fields planted, cattle purchased, the barn and outbuildings repaired. Zachary continued his duties as deputy, but no longer lost himself in the relentless pursuit of outlaws. Instead, he returned each evening to the warmth of home, to Madeline's welcoming smile and the life they were building together. Their first Christmas in the house was a celebration of new traditions blended with remembered ones. They hung stockings by the fireplace and decorated a small pine tree cut from their own land. On Christmas Eve, they exchanged gifts, practical items mostly, suited to their shared life on the ranch, but with one surprise. "This is for you," Madeline said, handing Zachary a small, carefully wrapped package. "I wasn't sure if it was the right thing, but—" He unwrapped it to find a silver-framed photograph of Elizabeth holding baby James, their faces captured in a moment of shared delight. His breath caught at the unexpected sight. "How did you?" "Sheriff Davis told me there had been a photograph," Madeline explained softly. "That it was damaged in the attack. I found the photographer in Denver who had taken it originally. He still had the negative." She touched his hand gently. "I thought it should be here in our home, a reminder of the love that helped make you the man you are." Tears welled in Zachary's eyes as he carefully placed the photograph on the mantel. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "for understanding that they'll always be part of me, part of this place." "Of course they will," Madeline said simply. "Just as my parents will always be part of me. The people we lose shape us as surely as the ones we find." That night, holding Madeline close in their bed, Zachary reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought him to this moment of contentment. The pain of his loss would never completely disappear, but it had changed, transformed into something he could carry without being crushed by its weight. And alongside it now was a new joy, a second chance he had never sought but had somehow found nonetheless. Spring brought new life to the ranch, calves in the pasture, wildflowers in the meadows, and the news that Madeline was expecting their first child. The announcement filled Zachary with a complex mixture of joy and apprehension. The memory of losing James was still raw in some ways, and the thought of being vulnerable again to such devastating loss was terrifying. He confessed his fears to Madeline one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. "I'm afraid," he admitted, his hand resting gently on the slight swell of her abdomen. "Afraid of losing you both. Afraid of not being the father this child deserves." "Oh, my love," Madeline said, covering his hand with her own. "Fear is natural, but we can't let it rule us. Your capacity for love is what will make you a wonderful father, that same depth of feeling that made losing Elizabeth and James so devastating." "How is it you always know exactly what to say?" he asked, drawing her closer against him. She smiled up at him, her face serene in the fading light. "Because I know you, Zachary Stanton. I know your heart." Summer passed into autumn, and as the leaves began to turn once more, Madeline's time drew near. Despite Zachary's concerns, the pregnancy had progressed without complication, with regular visits from the town's physician confirming that mother and child were doing well. On a clear October morning, almost exactly a year after their wedding, Madeline went into labor. Zachary sent for the doctor and Mrs. Hollister, who had become a dear friend and surrogate mother figure to them both. Then began the long, anxious waiting. Hour after hour passed as Zachary paced the downstairs rooms, each of Madeline's cries from above sending a spear of fear through his heart. This was the most helpless he had felt since that terrible day 3 years ago. Once again, the life of someone he loved hung in the balance, and once again, there was nothing he could do but wait and pray. As twilight descended, Mrs. Hollister appeared at the top of the stairs, her face wreathed in smiles despite her obvious fatigue. "Deputy Stanton," she called, "I believe there's someone up here who would like to meet you." Zachary took the stairs 2 at a time, his heart pounding. In the bedroom, Madeline lay propped against pillows, pale but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. She looked up as he entered, her smile more beautiful than he had ever seen it. "Come meet your son," she said softly. With trembling hands, Zachary accepted the tiny infant, staring in wonder at the perfect features of his face, the button nose, the rosebud mouth, the shock of dark hair. As if sensing his father's scrutiny, the baby opened his eyes, revealing irises of deep blue that would likely darken to match Zachary's own. "He's perfect," Zachary whispered, overwhelmed by the surge of love that swept through him, a love as powerful as what he had felt for James, yet distinct from it. Not a replacement, but a new branch of the same deep root. "What shall we call him?" "I thought perhaps Marcus, after my father," Madeline suggested, "but the final choice should be yours." Zachary considered for a moment, looking from the infant to Madeline and back again. "Marcus Zachary Stanton," he said finally, "a name to honor both sides of his heritage." Madeline's eyes filled with tears of joy. "It's perfect," she agreed, "just like he is." As darkness fell outside, the small family remained together in the warm cocoon of the bedroom, marveling at the new life that had joined them. Zachary, seated on the edge of the bed with one arm around Madeline and the other cradling their son, felt a sense of completion he had never expected to experience again. "Thank you," he said quietly, pressing a kiss to Madeline's temple. "For what?" she asked, leaning against him contentedly. "For finding me when I was lost, for believing there was something in me worth saving." He looked down at their sleeping child. "For giving me a reason to live again, not just exist." "We found each other," she corrected gently, "and in doing so found ourselves as well." As little Marcus stirred in his arms, Zachary reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 years ago, in the depths of his grief, he had been certain that his capacity for love and happiness had died with Elizabeth and James. He had become a shadow of himself, moving through life with mechanical purpose but no joy. Then Madeline had walked into the Golden Nugget Saloon with her request for help, and with one smile had begun to change everything. Not erasing the past, but helping him find a way to carry it without being crushed by its weight. Teaching him that the heart's capacity for love was not limited, that new joy did not diminish old memories, but rather gave them context and companionship. Outside the window, the first stars appeared in the deepening sky. Zachary thought of Elizabeth and James, carried now in his heart rather than as open wounds in his soul. He thought of Marcus Vale, whose quest for justice had ultimately led his daughter to Montrose. And he thought of the future stretching before them, a future bright with possibilities he had once believed forever lost to him. "I love you," he said to Madeline, the words coming easily now, no longer trapped behind walls of grief and guilt. "Both of you, more than I can ever express." "And we love you," she replied, reaching up to touch his face tenderly. "Always and completely." In that quiet moment, surrounded by the warmth of family and home, Zachary Stanton, once broken by tragedy, once certain he would never love again, found himself whole at last, his heart healed not by forgetting the past, but by having the courage to embrace the future. And it had all begun with a smile, one radiant smile, from a courageous woman that had changed his world forever.